Preface. The grasshopper of this book is the same grasshopper whom Aesop made everlastingly famous as the model of improvidence. But while Aesop was content to cast this remarkable creature as the hero of a cautionary tale, he appears here as the exemplification and articulate expositor of the life most worth living. Because he is a working utopian whose time has not yet come, he is destroyed by his uncompromising dedication to a premature ideal. But because he is also a speculative utopian, he is able to defend that ideal and the death which is the predictable consequence of its wholehearted pursuit before the end comes. Central to that defense is the grasshopper's claim that utopian existence is fundamentally concerned with game playing, and so the book is largely devoted to formulating a theory of games. That theory is not intended to be in any direct way a contribution to the field of investigation known officially as game theory, although it is possible that some game theorists may find it of more than marginal interest. Nor is the book essentially a contribution to sociology or social psychology, although it contains an extended discussion of role-playing, and one section is addressed to Eric Berne's Games People Play. The orientation of the book is philosophical in one traditional sense of the word. It is the attempt to discover and formulate a definition, and to follow the implications of that discovery even when they lead in surprising and sometimes disconcerting directions. I am aware, of course, of the fairly widespread disenchantment with the search for definitions that currently prevails in the philosophical community, and indeed in the intellectual community generally. And Wittgenstein, one of the most forceful spokesmen, and certainly the most exotic, for the anti-definitional attitude, is famous for having singled out the attempt to define games as illustrating par excellence the futility of attempting to define anything whatever. Don't say, Wittgenstein admonishes us, there must be something common or they would not be called games, but look and see whether there is anything common to all. This is unexceptionable advice. Unfortunately, Wittgenstein himself did not follow it. He looked, to be sure, but because he had decided beforehand that games are indefinable, his look was fleeting, and he saw very little. So I invite the reader to join me in a longer and more penetrating look at games, and to defer judgment as to whether all games have something in common pending completion of such an inspection. In order to avoid possible misunderstanding, I add a disclaimer. The following inquiry is not, and should not be taken to be, a kind of anti-definitional manifesto, nor should it be seen as depending for its cogency upon a commitment to the universal fruitfulness of definition construction. It seems altogether more reasonable to begin with the hypothesis that some things are definable and some are not, and that the only way to find out which are which is to follow Wittgenstein's excellent advice and look and see. Acknowledgments. Some parts of this book have appeared in print elsewhere. Chapter 1, the last part of Chapter 3, and Chapter 15 are revised versions of parts of two essays first published in The Philosophy of Sport, a collection of original essays, in 1973. The first part of Chapter 3 originally appeared under the title What is a Game? In Philosophy of Science in 1967. Chapter 7 appeared under its present title in Philosophy of Science in 1969, and several paragraphs in Chapter 3 are taken from Is Life a Game We Are Playing?, which was first printed in Ethics in 1967. Copyright 1967 by the University of Chicago. Grateful acknowledgment is made to the publishers for permission to include that material here. This book has been published with the help of a grant from the Humanities Research Council of Canada, using funds provided by the Canada Council. This book owes its existence in large part to a number of people for their encouragement of and interest in my pursuit of the study of games over the years. For that I thank Charner Perry, Richard Rudner, J. Sayer Minus, Nathan Brett, and especially Jan Narveson. I would like to acknowledge a genuinely delightful association with the staff of University of Toronto Press, especially R.I.K. Davidson, Jean Jamieson, Margaret Parker, Laurie Lewis, and William Reuter. For Nancy and Mark and Con. The Players. The Grasshopper, a shiftless but thoughtful practitioner of applied entomology. Skepticus and Prudence, disciples of the Grasshopper. Professor Snooze, an accident-prone academic. Dr. Threat, a murderer. Smith and Jones, two supporting players with a penchant for getting themselves into sticky but illustrative situations. Robinson, a friend of Smith and Jones, who is invoked by them when needed. Ivan and Abdul, two retired army officers looking for a bit of fun. The voice of logic, nemesis of Ivan and Abdul. Sir Edmund Hillary, a mountain climber. Porfirio Sneak, the greatest spy in the world. Bartholomew Drag, the greatest bore in the world. Dr. Huyshreka, a therapist consulted by Sneak and Drag. John Stryver and William Seeker, two disgruntled utopians. Chapter 1. Death of the Grasshopper, in which the Grasshopper, after defending to his disciples his way of life and impending death, dies. It was clear that the Grasshopper would not survive the winter, and his followers had gathered round him for what would no doubt be one of their last meetings. One of them were reconciled to his approaching death, but a few were still outraged that such a thing could be allowed to happen. Prudence was one of the latter, and she approached the Grasshopper with a final plea. "Grasshopper," she said, "a few of us have agreed to give up a share of our food to tide you over till spring. Then next summer you can work to pay us back." "My dear child," responded the Grasshopper, "you still don't understand. The fact is that I will not work to pay you back. I will not work at all. I made that perfectly clear, I thought, when the ant turned me away from his door. My going to him in the first place was, of course, a mistake. It was a weakness to which I shall not give in again." "But," continued Prudence, "we don't begrudge you a portion of our food. If you like, we will not require you to pay us back. We are not, after all, ants." "No," replied the Grasshopper. "You are not ants, not any more, but neither are you grasshoppers. Why should you give me the fruits of your labor? Surely that would not be just, when I tell you quite clearly that I will not pay you back." "But that kind of justice," exclaimed Prudence, "is only the justice of ants. Grasshoppers have nothing to do with such justice." "You are right," said the Grasshopper. "The justice, which is fairness in trading, is irrelevant to the lives of true grasshoppers. But there is a different kind of justice which prevents me from accepting your offer. Why are you willing to work so that I may live? Is it not because I embody in my life what you aspire to, and you do not want the model of your aspirations to perish? Your wish is understandable, and to a certain point even commendable, but at bottom it is inconsistent and self-defeating. It is also, and I hope you will not take offense at my blunt language, hypocritical." "Those are hard words, Grasshopper." "But well meant. My life, you must understand, was not intended to be a sideshow, yet that seems to be what you want to make of it. You should value me because you want to be like me, and not merely so that you can boast to the ants that you are an intimate of the grasshopper, that oddity of nature." "We have never done that, Grasshopper." "I believe you. But you might as well have done so if you believe that your proposal is a good one. For it amounts to working, because I will not. The whole burden of my teaching is that you ought to be idle. So now you propose to use me as a pretext not only for working, but for working harder than ever, since you would have not only yourselves to feed, but me as well. I call this hypocritical because you would like to take credit for doing something which is no more than a ruse for avoiding living up to your ideals." At this point, Skepticus broke in with a laugh. "What the Grasshopper means, Prudence," he said, "is that we do not yet have the courage of his convictions. The point is that we should not only refuse to work for the Grasshopper, we should also refuse to work for ourselves. We, like him, should be dying for our principles. That we are not is the respect in which, though no longer ants, we are not grasshoppers either. And, of course, given the premise that the life of the grasshopper is the only life worth living, what he says certainly follows." "Not quite, Skepticus," put in the grasshopper. "I agree that the principles in question are worth dying for, but I must remind you that they are the principles of grasshoppers. I am not here to persuade you to die for my principles, but to persuade you that I must. We ought to be quite clear about our respective roles. You are not here to die for me, but I for you. You only need, as Skepticus put it, the courage of my convictions up to a point, that is, courage sufficient to approve rather than to deplore my death. Neither of you is quite prepared to grant that approval, though for different reasons. You, Prudence, because although you believe the principles are worth dying for, you do not believe they need to be died for. And you, Skepticus, because you are not even sure that the principles are worth dying for." "Although," replied Skepticus, "I believe you to be the wisest being alive, which is why I have never left your side during the whole summer of your life, I have to admit that I am still not convinced that the life of the grasshopper is the best life to live. Perhaps if you could give me a clearer vision of the good life as you see it, my convictions would approach yours, and my courage as well. You might do this by one of the parables for which you are justly esteemed." "Parables, my dear Skepticus," replied the grasshopper, "ought to come at the end, not at the beginning of a serious inquiry. That is, only at the point where arguments fail. But speaking of parables, you may be sure that the ants will fashion one out of my career. They will very likely represent my life as a moral tale, the point of which is the superiority of a prudent to an idle way of life. But it should really be the grasshopper who is the hero of the tale. It is he, not the ant, who should have the hearer's sympathy. The point of the parable should be not the ant's triumph, but the grasshopper's tragedy. For one cannot help reflecting that if there were no winters to guard against, then the grasshopper would not get his comeuppance, nor the ant his shabby victory. The life of the grasshopper would be vindicated, and that of the ant absurd." "But there are winters to guard against," Prudence protested. "No doubt. Still, it is possible that with accelerating advances in technology the time will come when there are, in fact, no winters. We may therefore conclude that although my timing may be a bit off, my way of life is not wrong in principle." "The operation was successful, but the patient died," put in Skepticus. "No," replied the grasshopper, "it's not quite like that. That my way of life may eventually be vindicated in practice is, now that I think of it, really beside the point. Rather, it is the logic of my position which is at issue, and this logic shows that prudential actions, for example those actions which we ordinarily call work, are self-defeating in principle. For prudence may be defined as the disposition, 1. To sacrifice something good, for example leisure, if and only if such sacrifice is necessary for obtaining something better, for example survival, and 2. To reduce the number of good things requiring sacrifice, ideally at least to 0. The ideal of prudence, therefore, like the ideal of preventive medicine, is its own extinction. For if it were the case that no sacrifices of goods needed ever to be made, then prudential actions would be pointless, indeed impossible. This principle, knowledge of which I regard as an indispensable first step on the path to wisdom, the ants seem never even to have entertained. The true grasshopper sees the work is not self-justifying, and that his way of life is the final justification of any work whatever. But surely, replied Skepticus, you are carrying your point to an unreasonable extreme. You talk as though there were but two possible alternatives, either a life devoted exclusively to play or a life devoted exclusively to work. But most of us realize that our labor is valuable because it permits us to play, and we are presumably seeking to achieve some kind of balance between work input and play output. People are not, and do not want to be, wholly grasshoppers or wholly ants, but a combination of the two. People are, and want to be, if you will forgive a regrettably vulgar but spooneristically inevitable construction, asshoppers or grants. We can, of course, all cease to work, but if we do, then we cannot play for long either, for we will shortly die. I have 3 answers to make to what you have said, Skepticus, and I fear I shall have to make them quickly, for the sun has set and the frost is already creeping through the fields. First, evidently I was put on earth just to play out my life and die, and it would be impious of me to go against my destiny. That is, if you like, the theology of the case. But second, there is also a logic of the case which is as inescapable as fate, or, if you like, a fate of the case which is as inescapable as logic. The only argument against living the life of the grasshopper arises from the contingent fact that at present one dies if one does not work. The answer to that argument is that my death is inevitable in any case, for if I am improvident in summer, then I will die in winter, and if I am provident in summer, then I will cease to be the grasshopper by definition. But I will be either provident or improvident in summer. There is no third alternative. Therefore, either I die, or I cease to be the grasshopper. But since I am just the grasshopper, no more and no less, dying and ceasing to be the grasshopper are one and the same thing for me. I cannot escape that logic or that fate. Still, since I am the grasshopper and you are not, it would seem to follow that you are not compelled by this logic. As I intimated earlier, I often think that I was put on earth just to die for you, to bear that heavy but inevitable cross. But I confess that this is when I am in something of an early Christian or late pagan frame of mind. At other times, and this brings me to my third and final answer to your objection, Skepticus, I have the oddest notion that both of you are grasshoppers in disguise. In fact, that everyone alive is really a grasshopper. At this, Prudence whispered to Skepticus, "The end must be near. His mind is beginning to wander." But Skepticus just looked keenly at their friend and teacher as he continued to speak. "I admit that this is a wild fancy," the grasshopper was saying, "and I hesitate to tell you my thoughts. Still, I am used to being thought foolish, so I shall proceed, inviting you to make of my words what you will. Then let me tell you that I have always had a recurring dream, in which it is revealed to me, though how it is revealed I cannot say, that everyone alive is in fact engaged in playing elaborate games, while at the same time believing themselves to be going about their ordinary affairs. Carpenters, believing themselves to be merely pursuing their trade, are really playing a game, and similarly with politicians, philosophers, lovers, murderers, thieves, and saints. Whatever occupation or activity you can think of, it is in reality a game. This revelation is, of course, astonishing. The sequel is terrifying, for in the dream I then go about persuading everyone I find of the great truth which has been revealed to me. How I am able to persuade them I do not know, though persuade them I do. But precisely at the point when each is persuaded, and this is the ghastly part, each ceases to exist. It is not just that my auditor vanishes on the spot, though indeed he does. It is that I also know with absolute certainty that he no longer exists anywhere. It is as though he had never been. Appalled as I am by the results of my teaching, I cannot stop, but quickly move on to the next creature with my news, until I have preached the truth throughout the universe, and have converted everyone to oblivion. Finally, I stand alone beneath the summer stars in absolute despair. Then I awaken to the joyful knowledge that the world is still teeming with sentient beings after all, and that it was only a dream. I see the carpenter and philosopher going about their work as before. But is it, I ask myself, just as before? Is the carpenter on his rooftop simply hammering nails, or is he making some move in an ancient game whose rules he has forgotten? But now the chill creeps up my legs. I grow drowsy. Dear friends, farewell.